He should have let the man freeze. That was the smart play. The only play, really. Out here on the high plains in 1879, the world had a simple rule. You take care of yours, and you let the world take care of the rest. And the world was currently trying to bury a man under a mountain of snow and ice, right at the edge of Ezra Blackwood's fence line. The wind was screaming like a banshee, tearing at the logs of his cabin, a cabin that had been silent for a year. Too silent. Inside, the fire was dying. Outside, a man was dying. Ezra watched through the one clear patch on the frosted window pane. The figure had stumbled out of the whiteout, a dark smudge against an endless, churning sea of white. It staggered, fell, got up, and fell again. A ghost fighting a losing battle with a bigger ghost. Then it just collapsed. A heap of dark cloth that was disappearing faster than you could blink, getting swallowed by the blizzard. Every instinct, every hard lesson this land had taught him, screamed to leave it be. Bar the door. Add another log to the fire. Forget you saw anything. Strangers weren't friends out here. They were trouble. They were thieves or killers, or just another mouth to feed when you barely had enough for yourself. Survival was a sharp, lonely business. Ezra had learned that lesson in the cruelest way possible. He'd buried his wife, Abigail. He'd buried his boy, Samuel. He was done with the world. He just wanted it to be done with him. But then he saw Abigail's face in his mind, clear as day. Her kindness, the thing that had made this brutal land feel like a home. He saw Samuel's small hands trying to whittle a piece of wood into the shape of a bird. He cursed, a low, guttural sound the wind snatched right out of his mouth. He couldn't. He just couldn't let a man die out there, not 50 yards from his door. It was a line, maybe the last line he had left. He pulled his worn coat tighter, wrapped a scarf around his face until only his eyes showed, and leaned into the storm. It was like walking into a solid wall. The snow wasn't falling. It was flying sideways, sharp and blinding. It clawed at him, stole his breath, tried to push him back into the warmth of his cabin. Every step was a fight. The drifts were already up to his waist, a thick, heavy powder that felt like quicksand. He pushed forward, following a memory of where the man had fallen. He found him, or he found the mound that he knew had to be him. He dug with numb, clumsy fingers, scraping away the snow. He rolled the body over, and his blood ran cold. The man's face was stark, with high cheekbones and skin the color of wet copper. His hair was long and black, already matted with ice. He was Cheyenne, one of the specters from the stories in town. The savages they spit about over barrels of crackers and salted pork. The distant fear that was supposed to stay distant. Now it was here, unconscious, half frozen on his land. Ezra's mind screamed. This was worse than a thief. This was an enemy, a ghost from a world he wanted no part of. The prejudices he'd soaked up without thinking, they all came rushing back. Leave him. This is not your problem. This is a sign. But the man's buckskin clothes were thin, useless against this kind of cold. There were no weapons in sight, no rifle, no bow, just a man who was dying. With a groan that was half effort, half agony of spirit, Ezra heaved him up over his shoulder. The weight was immense, a dead, solid thing. His own body, thin from a year of barely eating, screamed in protest. He fought his way back, one agonizing step at a time, the wind trying to tear the man from his grasp. He kicked the cabin door open and stumbled inside, dropping his burden on the rough floorboards. He slammed the door shut, and the sudden silence was deafening. He stood there panting, his breath coming in white clouds in the cabin's frigid air. The fire was just embers. The only other sound was the faint, shallow breathing of the man on his floor. He had dragged the wilderness inside. He had brought the boogeyman into his home. He looked down at the unconscious form, a living embodiment of every whispered fear. He had no idea if he'd just saved a life or if he'd just signed his own death warrant. He got to work, moving like a machine. He dragged the man closer to the hearth and threw on more logs until the flames roared back to life. He had to get the wet, frozen clothes off him. He pulled at the stiff buckskin tunic, and as he lifted it, something heavy and cold fell out from an inside fold, hitting the floorboards with a soft clink. It was a small silver locket, tarnished and dented, hanging on a delicate chain. It was a white man's locket. No question about it. Ezra's hands froze. His heart, which had been hammering from the exertion, now hammered with a different kind of energy. Fear. He picked it up. His fingers were so cold he could barely work the clasp. He fumbled with it, his breath held tight in his chest until it finally popped open. Inside, behind a cracked piece of glass, was a photograph, a tintype of a young woman with a severe hairstyle, holding a small, solemn-looking child on her lap. Settlers. The kind of family you'd see passing through on their way west. The kind of family that sometimes just disappeared. His mind went to a dark place, a very dark place. Where did this man get this locket? Was he a scavenger, picking through the ruins of a failed homestead? Or was he the one who made it fail? Was he a killer? A raider? The man on the floor wasn't just a Cheyenne anymore. He was a Cheyenne with a settler woman's locket. Ezra's gaze shot to the man's belt. No scalp. He let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. But the locket, it was almost worse. It was a story with a beginning and a middle, and Ezra was terrified of the ending. He thought of Abigail and Samuel. He thought of the fever that took them, a quiet, invisible enemy. This felt different. This was a violence he could see, that he could hold in his hand. For a second, a cold, hard rage filled him. He could drag the man back outside right now. Let the storm finish the job. It would be justice. An eye for an eye. Who would ever know? He could just drop him in a drift, and by morning, there'd be nothing left. But the man let out a low, pained moan, a purely human sound. Ezra looked from the locket to the man's face. He was just a boy, really. Younger than Ezra had first thought. Maybe 20 years old. His face, even unconscious, was etched with hardship, but not cruelty. Or was he just seeing what he wanted to see? He snapped the locket shut. He couldn't leave him to die. He couldn't. But he couldn't trust him either. He slipped the locket into his own pocket. A cold, heavy secret. He finished stripping off the frozen buckskins and wrapped the man in every blanket he owned. He chafed the man's feet, which were a pale, waxy white, until some color started to return. He worked with a grim determination, his mind a whirlwind of suspicion and doubt. He spent the rest of the day and all through the long, howling night sitting in his chair, his rifle across his lap. He watched. He watched the steady rise and fall of the blankets. He watched the man's color slowly return to something resembling life. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. He was a jailer and a nursemaid all at once, guarding a man who might be his patient, his prisoner, or his executioner. The blizzard didn't stop. It was a siege. The snow piled up against the walls. The wind shrieked through the cracks. The world outside had vanished, and all that existed was this small, fire-lit room and the two men inside. Sometime in the dark, gray hours before dawn, the man stirred. His eyes snapped open. And they weren't groggy or confused. They were dark, sharp, and intelligent. And they were filled with a suspicion as deep and as cold as the storm outside. In one sweeping glance, he took in everything. The log walls, the hearth, the rifle in Ezra's lap, and finally Ezra himself. His body tensed under the blankets, every muscle coiled. Even weak as he was, Ezra could see the warrior in him, the instinct to fight. He was a cornered animal, ready to lash out. Ezra didn't move a muscle. He slowly, deliberately held up one hand, palm open. A gesture he hoped meant the same thing in every language. I'm not a threat. He set the rifle down on the floor beside his chair, but he kept it close. The air in the cabin was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. Neither of them moved. Two enemies trapped in a box by a force of nature, waiting to see who would blink first. The silence stretched on for what felt like an hour. Finally, Ezra stood up, moving with a slow, deliberate calm he didn't feel. He ladled some thin broth, made from salted pork and dried vegetables, into a bowl. He approached the man, his every sense on high alert. He offered the bowl. The man's eyes narrowed. He searched Ezra's face, looking for a trick, for a hint of poison or treachery. Ezra just stood there holding the bowl steady, letting the steam rise between them. It was a test, a fragile, unspoken negotiation. After a long, tense moment, the man gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Ezra helped him sit up. The man took the bowl in hands that trembled slightly. From cold or weakness, Ezra couldn't tell. He drank the broth slowly, his eyes never leaving Ezra's face. When he was done, he handed the bowl back. Another short nod. It was the only thank you Ezra would get, but it was enough. And so it began, their strange, silent life together. The storm raged for 2 more days, a relentless, howling monster that kept them locked in their cage. They didn't speak. What was there to say? They communicated with gestures, with glances. If Ezra needed wood from the pile by the door, the man would shift his legs. When the man's breath came in a dry, rattling cough, Ezra would bring him water. They were two wolves sharing a den, wary and watchful, aware of every single breath, every tiny movement the other made. Ezra found himself studying the man, watching him when he slept, looking for clues, for some sign of the monster who might have orphaned that child in the locket. But he saw nothing. He saw a quiet dignity, a stillness that felt ancient. The man in turn watched Ezra with a gaze that was unnerving in its intensity. It was a gaze that missed nothing. It saw the way Ezra's eyes would drift to the small, lopsided wooden bird on the mantelpiece, Samuel's last creation. It saw the way Ezra would sometimes stop and stare at Abigail's empty rocking chair, a hollow look on his face. On the third night, the confinement started to eat at Ezra. The grief he kept buried under a mountain of chores and exhaustion began to claw its way to the surface. The wind outside sounded like a woman crying, and it was a sound he knew all too well. He was staring at the little wooden bird, seeing Samuel's face. His tongue stuck out in concentration as he carved it. He saw Abigail, smiling, her hands dusted with flour, telling him it was the most beautiful bird she'd ever seen. The loss hit him like a physical blow, a punch to the gut that stole his breath. He didn't even realize a single tear was cutting a clean path through the grime on his cheek until he felt a presence beside him. The Cheyenne man had moved without a sound. He was standing right next to Ezra's chair. He didn't speak. He just looked at the wooden bird, then back at Ezra's face, and in his dark eyes there was no pity. There was something else, something much deeper. Understanding, a shared knowledge of loss that needed no words. He reached out and placed a hand on Ezra's shoulder. The touch was firm, brief, and surprisingly grounding. It was a gesture that jumped across the chasm of language and race and prejudice. It was just one man, acknowledging the pain of another. Then he took his hand back and returned to his spot by the fire, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. The ice in the room, and the ice in Ezra's heart, had cracked. The suspicion was still there, a cold stone in his gut where the locket rested in his pocket. But it wasn't the only thing there anymore. The next morning, the storm had lessened to a dull roar. The man seemed stronger. He was sitting up on his own, watching the fire. Ezra noticed a long, jagged tear in his buckskin tunic, right near the shoulder. An old wound maybe, or just wear and tear. On an impulse he didn't fully understand, Ezra went to a small wooden chest in the corner and took out Abigail's sewing kit. He held up the needle and thread, a silent question. The man watched him for a long moment. Then he nodded and slipped the tunic off. His torso was corded with muscle, but it was also a roadmap of old scars. A life of violence and hardship was written on his skin. Ezra sat on a stool and began to stitch the torn buckskin. His fingers, clumsy from axe handles and wire, struggled with the fine needle. But the simple act felt right. It felt like he was mending something more than just a piece of clothing. As he worked the needle through the tough leather, his fingers brushed against the man's shoulder. He was focused on his work when his gaze fell on a particular scar on the man's forearm. It was a strange one. Not a clean cut from a knife or an arrow, but a jagged, ugly burn, shaped almost like a crude crescent moon. Ezra's breath caught in his throat. His fingers went still. He'd seen that scar before. Not on a living man, on a dead one. 2 years ago, a small band of prospectors had been found dead up in the foothills. It was a brutal scene. The talk in town was that it was a Cheyenne raiding party. One of the bodies, a man named Henderson, had been found clutching a branding iron he'd apparently tried to use as a weapon. The story was that he'd managed to mark one of the raiders before he went down. The mark was a crescent moon from a broken piece of the brand. They said one of the raiders had gotten away, wounded. Ezra looked from the scar to the man's face. His expression was calm, unreadable. Was this him? Was he looking at the man who had killed Henderson and his partners? The questions came rushing back, a tidal wave of doubt and fear. Who was this man he had saved? Who was he sharing his fire with? He finished the stitching, his hands trembling slightly. He handed the tunic back. The man examined the neat, tight stitches. He looked at Ezra, a flicker of something, gratitude, maybe respect, in his eyes. Then he spoke, his first word. His voice was a low rasp, rough from disuse. "Vulcan," he said, touching his own chest. Ezra hesitated for a beat, his mind reeling. The scar, the locket, the prospectors. He swallowed hard. "Ezra," he replied, touching his own chest. A name, a fragile bridge built over a chasm of secrets and blood. Later that day, the storm finally died. The world outside went quiet. Vulcan, seeing that the weather had turned, got to his feet. He was still weak, but he was steady. He walked to the door and looked out at the sea of white. It was time for him to go. As he stood there, he turned back to Ezra. Using a piece of charcoal from the hearth, he knelt and began to draw on the floorboards. It was a map, rough but clear. He drew the mountains, Ezra's homestead, a winding creek. Then he drew a line, a path through a narrow hidden canyon. He tapped it, then pointed to the west, to where his people were. He was showing Ezra a secret way, a path the settlers didn't know about. Why? A payment for the food? A warning? Or something else entirely? Before Ezra could even process the meaning of the map, a new sound broke the silence. The crunch of boots on fresh snow, and then a man's rough laughter. Ezra's head snapped up. Through the window he saw them, 3 riders picking their way through the drifts, their horses steaming in the cold air. They were heading straight for the cabin. A wisp of smoke from his chimney had been a beacon. The man in the lead was tall and thin, with a cruel twist to his mouth that Ezra recognized instantly. Garrett Vance. A claim jumper, a bully, and a man with a reputation for casual violence that made even the hard men in town nervous. Vance swung down from his horse with an air of arrogant ownership. "Well now," he called out, his voice grating, "look what we got here. A little mouse tucked all warm in his hole." His eyes swept over the cabin, and then he saw Vulcan standing in the shadows of the doorway. Vance's lazy smirk vanished. It was replaced by a hungry, predatory gleam. "Well, well," Vance sneered, his hand dropping to the pistol on his hip. "Hiding a redskin, are you, farmer? There's a bounty on any Cheyenne caught off the reservation. Not much, but enough to keep me in whiskey for a week." He looked past Ezra, directly at Vulcan. "Heard you boys were responsible for some prospectors up in the hills a couple years back. My brother was one of them." Vance's 2 men dismounted, spreading out, their hands on their guns. The friendly winter morning had just turned deadly. "He's just a traveler," Ezra said, his voice flat and steady. He moved to block the doorway, putting his own body between Vance and Vulcan. "Caught in the storm." Vance laughed, a short, ugly bark. "A traveler? That's what you call it." His eyes were small and hard, like chips of ice. "My brother, Matthew, he was a traveler too. Now he's just bones in an unmarked grave." The personal hatred rolled off him in waves. This wasn't about a $5 bounty. This was about blood. "Hand him over, Blackwood," Vance ordered. "This ain't your fight." The moment froze. The air was sharp and clean and full of death. Everything in Ezra screamed at him to step aside. This was it, the easy way out. Give Vance what he wanted. He'd probably take some food, rough Ezra up a bit, and leave. It was the smart play, the survival play. Vulcan might be a killer. He had the scar. He had the locket. He was everything the world said Ezra should hate and fear. But Ezra didn't see a raider. He didn't see a savage. He saw the man who had repaired his floor. He saw the man who had put a comforting hand on his shoulder in a moment of shared grief. He saw the man who had trusted him with a secret map. He saw a human being. He had shared his fire with this man. He had stitched his clothes. He had looked into his eyes and seen not a monster, but a man. A bond had been forged in that silent cabin, something stronger than prejudice, stronger than fear. He couldn't sell that for an easy life. He couldn't sell it for any price. Ezra's resolve, which had been eroded by grief for so long, suddenly hardened into something unbreakable. Purpose. He looked Garrett Vance straight in the eye. "No," he said. The word was quiet, but it echoed in the vast silence of the plains. Vance's face contorted in a mask of disbelief and rage. "What did you say to me?" "I said no," Ezra repeated, his voice stronger now. "He was freezing to death. He's under my roof, under my protection. You want him? You come through me." Vance's cruel smile returned, colder than ever. "I was hoping you'd say that," he hissed. "I've been wanting a reason to take this piece of land off your hands, ever since your wife and kid died. It's too much for one man to handle." He drew his pistol, the click of the hammer cocking sounding like a thunderclap. "Last chance, Blackwood. Step aside or die with him." Inside the cabin, Ezra heard a soft scraping sound. Vulcan arming himself with the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. He wasn't alone in this. That was all he needed to know. Ezra slowly backed into the cabin and reached for his rifle. The movement was his final answer. "Get him!" Vance roared, surging forward. "Burn the whole damn place to the ground!" The world exploded. Ezra slammed the heavy plank door just as a body crashed against it from the outside. He fumbled with the bar, his hands slick with sweat, and dropped it into its iron brackets a split second before a bullet splintered the wood right next to his head. Gunsmoke filled the air, acrid and sharp. He scrambled away from the door, his heart trying to hammer its way out of his chest. Vulcan was a blur of motion on the other side of the room, the iron poker held like a weapon, his eyes blazing with a fire that burned away all traces of his former weakness. Another shot tore through the window, shattering the glass and letting in a blast of Arctic air. "Come on out, you filthy sympathizer!" Vance screamed from outside. "Make it easy on yourself." Ezra knew they couldn't win a siege. The cabin was a wooden box, a coffin. He looked at Vulcan. A silent, desperate plan passed between them. He pointed to the small shuttered window on the back wall, the one that looked out toward the barn. It was their only hope. While Vance and his men started using a log as a battering ram against the front door, Ezra clawed at the frozen latch of the rear shutter. It was frozen solid. He threw his shoulder against it, again and again, grunting with the effort. Finally, with a groan of tortured wood, it gave way. "Go!" Ezra hissed, gesturing Vulcan toward the opening. "Get out of here! Find your people!" Vulcan hesitated. His eyes were locked on Ezra's. He was a warrior. You could see it in his stance, in the set of his jaw. He was not a man to run from a fight, especially not a fight that was being fought for him. "Go!" Ezra yelled, more forcefully this time. "I'll hold them off." It was a stupid lie, and they both knew it. But it was the only card they had left to play. Vulcan gave him one last intense look, a look that said everything that words could not. Gratitude, regret, a promise of something Ezra couldn't decipher. Then, with a fluid grace that defied his recent injuries, he slipped through the narrow window and vanished into the snowdrifts. Ezra was alone. He felt a sharp pang of something. Betrayal? Despair? Had he just made the biggest mistake of his life? He didn't have time to think about it. At that exact moment, the front door splintered with a deafening crack and burst inward. Vance and his two thugs spilled into the room, their faces ugly masks of triumph. "Nowhere left to run, farmer," Vance snarled. Ezra didn't hesitate. He brought the rifle to his shoulder and fired. The enclosed space of the cabin magnified the roar into a physical force. He wasn't aiming to kill, not yet. He was aiming to slow them down. The bullet caught one of the men in the thigh, and he went down with a high-pitched scream, clutching his leg. Before the others could react, Ezra lunged, swinging the heavy rifle like a club. He caught the second man across the side of the head. The man staggered back, stunned, blood pouring from a gash on his temple. But Vance was faster. He was a predator. He sidestepped Ezra's clumsy attack and brought the barrel of his own pistol down in a vicious arc, smashing it into Ezra's forearm. Pain, white-hot and blinding, shot up Ezra's arm. His fingers went numb and the rifle clattered to the floor. Vance kicked it away out of reach. He raised his pistol, the barrel a perfect, black circle of death aimed right between Ezra's eyes. A victorious, cruel snarl spread across his face. "You stupid, sentimental fool," Vance spat. "You threw your life away for nothing." It was over. Ezra closed his eyes, waiting for the end. He thought of Abigail. He thought of Samuel. Then he heard it. Not a gunshot. A scream. But it wasn't his scream. It was a war cry. A sound that seemed to come from the very throat of the wilderness itself. Vance's head whipped around. Ezra's eyes snapped open. Vulcan hadn't run. He hadn't fled. He had circled. Using the deep snow for cover, moving with the silence of a ghost, he had come around the cabin and burst back in through the shattered front door. He wasn't a refugee anymore. He wasn't a patient. He was a warrior in his element. In his hand, he held a thick, heavy branch he must have ripped from a snow-laden pine tree, and he wielded it like a war club. He moved with a speed and ferocity that was terrifying. Before Vance could even turn his pistol, Vulcan swung the heavy club in a brutal, horizontal arc. It connected with Vance's wrist with a sickening crack of bone. The pistol flew from his grasp, landing in a snowdrift just outside the door. Vance shrieked in agony, clutching his shattered hand, his face a mask of shocked disbelief. The fight was short, and it was savage. The second thug, still dazed, tried to draw his own weapon, but Ezra, filled with a surge of adrenaline, drove his shoulder into the man's chest, sending him crashing backward over a stool. Vulcan was on Vance, not with the club now, but with his bare hands. He was a whirlwind of controlled violence. He didn't kill Vance. He dismantled him. He broke his other arm with a swift, brutal twist. The man on the floor with the wounded leg was trying to crawl away. The one Ezra had knocked down was scrambling to his feet, his eyes wide with terror. He wasn't looking at Ezra. He was looking at Vulcan, and he was seeing a nightmare come to life. He turned and fled, stumbling out of the cabin and scrambling for his horse. The wounded man dragged himself after him. Vance, broken and sobbing in a heap on the floor, was kicked mercilessly out of the cabin by Vulcan. He cradled his ruined arms, his face a mess of blood, tears, and dirt. He shot one last look at Ezra, a look of pure, venomous hatred. "This isn't over, Blackwood," he screamed, his voice choked with pain. "I'll be back. I'll bring the whole damn territory down on you. I'll see you burn for this." Then he stumbled away, following his men, a pathetic, broken figure disappearing into the blinding white. The silence that fell was more profound than the silence of the storm. The cabin was a wreck. The door was off its hinges. The window was a gaping hole. Blood stained the snow and the floorboards. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and sweat and fear. Ezra leaned against the wall, his body trembling, the adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving behind a deep, throbbing pain in his arm where Vance had struck him. It was a deep, open gash, bleeding freely. Vulcan came to him. The warrior's fire was gone from his eyes, replaced by a calm concern. He gently took Ezra's injured arm and inspected the wound. Without a word, he tore a clean strip of cloth from one of Ezra's own shirts. With a surprising gentleness, he cleaned the gash and bound it tightly. Their roles were now completely reversed. He was the caretaker, Ezra the patient. When he was finished, they stood there for a long moment amidst the wreckage, the cold wind whistling through the broken window. The suspicion, the fear, the prejudice. It had all been burned away in the fire of that short, brutal fight. In its place was something solid, something real, a bond, forged in blood and shared risk. Vulcan knew he had to leave. Vance's threat wasn't an idle one. He would be back, and he would bring more men. And Vulcan's own people, his hunting party, they would be searching for him, frantic with worry. He walked to the ruined doorway and looked out across the snow. Then he turned back to Ezra. He stepped forward. He placed his palm flat against his own chest, over his heart. Then he reached out and placed that same hand over Ezra's heart. His dark eyes held Ezra's gaze, and in them was a universe of meaning, a debt of honor acknowledged, a promise made, a gratitude so profound it needed no language. With one final sharp nod, he turned and walked out of the cabin. He didn't look back. He moved with a steady, purposeful stride, a lone, dark figure against the immense, silent white, until the curve of the land swallowed him and he was gone. Ezra stood in the doorway for a long time, the cold air on his face feeling like a slap, waking him up from a long nightmare. He was alone again. The cabin was destroyed. His arm throbbed. A dangerous enemy had sworn revenge. By any rational measure, his life was far worse than it had been just a few days ago. And yet, he didn't feel despair. For the first time in over a year, the crushing weight of his grief felt lighter. It wasn't gone. It would never be gone. But it had shifted. The cabin no longer felt like a tomb. The silence was no longer the sound of absence. It was the sound of contemplation. He had been tested, and he hadn't backed down. He had chosen connection over isolation. He had chosen compassion over fear. For the first time since he had carved the names of his wife and son into two wooden crosses, Ezra Blackwood felt a flicker of something he had thought was lost forever. Hope. He turned and went back inside. He looked at the chaos, the splintered wood, the blood. He took a deep breath. He picked up the small carved wolf that Vulcan had made, which had been knocked to the floor in the fight, and set it carefully back on the mantelpiece, right next to Samuel's bird. Then he set about putting his home back in order. The next day dawned bright and brutally cold. Every snap of a tree branch in the distance, every gust of wind, made Ezra jump. He spent the morning patching his door as best he could and boarding up the shattered window. His rifle was never more than an arm's length away. He was a man with something to lose again. A man with something to defend. The feeling was so foreign it was almost painful. It was just after noon when he saw them. Movement on the horizon. His heart leaped into his throat. He squinted, his hands shielding his eyes from the glare of the sun on the snow. It wasn't 2 or 3 riders, as he'd feared. It was a line. A long, dark line of figures on horseback, moving like a slow, inexorable river across the plains. And they were heading directly for his homestead. There weren't 10 of them, or 20. There were dozens, maybe 100. A war party. A cold dread, colder than any winter wind, washed over him. His first thought was Vance. Had he somehow met up with a larger group? Or was this Vulcan's people? Had Vulcan been captured, forced to lead them here? Or worse, had he betrayed him? Had the whole thing, the shared silence, the fight, been some kind of elaborate trick? The questions hammered at him, each one more terrifying than the last. He had survived the storm, the fight, only to be wiped off the face of the earth by a force he could not possibly hope to stand against. He could run, try to hide in the woods, but they would track him. He could barricade himself in the cabin, but they would burn him out. No, he wouldn't hide. He had drawn a line in the snow, and he would stand on it. He walked out of the cabin, rifle in hand, and stood his ground. A lone, defiant figure against the vast, unforgiving white, waiting for the tidal wave to hit. He would face what was coming on his own 2 feet. As the riders got closer, the sound of their ponies' hooves became a low, rumbling thunder. He could make out their faces now, stark and grim, painted for war. They were all Cheyenne. And at their head, riding a magnificent paint horse, was Vulcan. But this was not the Vulcan Ezra knew. The storm-battered refugee was gone. The quiet companion was gone. This man was transformed. He wore a breathtaking war bonnet of eagle feathers that trailed all the way down his back. His chest was adorned with a breastplate of polished bone and beads. He carried a round shield painted with symbols Ezra didn't understand, and a long feather-adorned lance. He rode with the easy, unshakable authority of a man born to lead. He was not just a warrior, he was a chief. The warriors fanned out, surrounding the small homestead in a silent, intimidating circle. They just sat there on their horses, watching him. 100 pairs of eyes, all unreadable, all fixed on him. The silence was absolute, terrifying. Ezra's heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. Betrayal. Vulcan's face was a mask of stone. He looked right through Ezra, as if he'd never seen him before. Ezra raised his rifle, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold it. So this is how it ends. Alone. Betrayed. And 1,000 miles from anything that ever mattered. Vulcan finally moved. He raised his lance. He didn't point it at Ezra. He pointed it toward the small hill overlooking the cabin, toward the 2 wooden crosses where Abigail and Samuel were buried. Ezra flinched, a fresh wave of despair washing over him. They were going to desecrate the graves, a final act of cruelty before they killed him. But then a younger warrior nudged his horse forward. He stopped beside Vulcan, and he spoke in clear, though heavily accented English. "He is Vulcan," the young man said, his voice calm. "He is a war chief of the dog soldiers. He honors the spirits of your family. He says they must have been great people to have raised such an honorable man." The world tilted on its axis. Ezra swayed on his feet, the rifle suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. He lowered it, his mind struggling to comprehend. "Honor?" The young warrior continued to translate as Vulcan spoke, his own voice a low, powerful rumble. "He has told our council the story, how you pulled him from the storm when his spirit was leaving his body, how you shared your fire, your food, how you mended his tunic." Vulcan's eyes, which had been so cold and distant, now met Ezra's, and in them, Ezra saw the man from the cabin again. "He told them how you stood against the men who came for him, how you bled for him." Vulcan spoke again, a long stream of words. The translator listened, then turned back to Ezra. "He says you did not see a Cheyenne, you saw a man. For this, the debt he owes you is now the debt of our people. His honor is our honor." Then the translator's expression hardened slightly. "Our scouts were sent to follow the tracks of the men who troubled you. Their journey is over. They will not trouble this land again." The finality in his tone was chilling. Garrett Vance would not be coming back. Ever. At a gesture from Vulcan, several warriors came forward, leading horses that were heavily laden with bundles. They began to unload them, piling them at Ezra's feet. Thick, rich buffalo robes, piles of beaver and fox pelts, huge slabs of smoked and dried meat, more than he could possibly eat in a year. And finally, they brought forward two strong, healthy ponies, their breath pluming in the crisp air. It was a fortune, a king's ransom on the frontier. Ezra was speechless. He stared at the mountain of wealth, completely overwhelmed. I can't accept this," he stammered, finding his voice. "I only did what any man should do." The translator smiled faintly as Vulcan spoke a reply. "He says you did what few men would. And this is not a payment. It is a gift of honor, from a friend to a friend." Vulcan dismounted. He walked over to Ezra, his presence powerful and immense. He looked at the patched-up door, the boarded window. He gently touched Ezra's bandaged arm. Then he looked Ezra in the eye, and the respect there was as vast as the plains around them. He clasped Ezra's good arm, a warrior's grip, firm and solid. Then he turned, mounted his horse in one fluid motion, and rejoined the line of warriors. The translator had one last message. "This place," he said, sweeping his hand to encompass Ezra's small plot of land, "will now be known to our people as the House of the Open Door. It is a place of peace. Our warriors will know its boundaries. They will protect it as their own. You will not be troubled here again." With a single, unified movement, the entire war party turned and began to ride away. A silent, powerful river of men flowing back the way they came, their forms stark against the endless white. Ezra stood and watched them go, a solitary farmer surrounded by a king's wealth, with two new horses nudging his shoulder as if they'd always been there. He watched until the last rider vanished over the horizon. He was alone again, but the silence was different now. It was filled with peace. He looked out at the harsh, unforgiving land. It hadn't changed. But he had. He walked back into his cabin. The hearth was warm. His gaze fell to the mantelpiece. Samuel's lopsided bird and Vulcan's howling wolf stood side by side. He reached into his pocket and his fingers closed around the cold, hard shape of the silver locket. He had forgotten all about it. He pulled it out and opened it one last time, looking at the grim faces of the woman and child. He understood now. This wasn't Vulcan's trophy from some recent raid. This was from the fight with Vance's brother, all that time ago. A spoil of an old war. A ghost from a life Vulcan had been forced to live. What could he do with it? He couldn't return it. He couldn't keep it. It was a piece of a story that was over. A story of hatred and revenge. His story was different now. He walked to the fire, and after a long moment, he tossed the locket into the heart of the flames. The silver blackened, then melted, disappearing into the embers. He was letting go of the past, all of it. The land was still harsh, the winters still long, but Ezra Blackwood was no longer just surviving. He was beginning to live again. A man who had opened his door to an enemy, and in doing so, had found a brother. A man who had learned that the truest measure of a home wasn't the strength of its walls, but the reach of its heart. This story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest risks lead to the greatest rewards, and that compassion is a language that everyone understands. If you were in Ezra's position, what would you have done? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what's coming next.